He thought asking her to leave would be routine, just another quiet removal in a place built for people who belonged. But he had no idea he was about to humiliate the one person who could end his career with a single sentence. The first-class lounge at JFK shimmered under warm golden lighting, a polished sanctuary of quiet wealth, where every detail from the marble floors to the soft leather seating whispered exclusivity. Businessmen in tailored suits checked their watches, crystal glasses clinked softly, and a low hum of privilege filled the air. Then the doors slid open, and Emily Carter stepped inside. She wore a simple gray sweater, slightly faded at the sleeves, comfortable jeans, and white sneakers that had clearly seen better days. Her small carry-on rolled behind her, wheels clicking faintly against the marble. For a brief moment no one said anything, but eyes shifted. Conversation slowed just enough to notice her presence, like a ripple moving through still water. She didn't rush, she didn't hesitate, her posture steady, her expression calm, as if she had every right to be there. And that quiet confidence only made the contrast sharper. A woman seated near the window lowered her sunglasses slightly, whispering to the man beside her. Another passenger glanced at Emily's shoes, then back at his champagne glass with a faint smirk. And across the room, standing near the concierge desk, Richard Hayes noticed immediately. He had spent 15 years in premium service, training his eye to categorize people within seconds, and to him, Emily didn't fit the profile. Not even close. He adjusted his tie, smoothing his jacket before walking toward her with practiced authority, his shoes making deliberate sounds against the floor, each step calculated, each movement controlled, until he stopped just a few feet in front of her. "Ma'am," he said, his tone polite but firm, "this area is reserved for first-class passengers." Emily looked up, meeting his gaze. Without flinching, and without a word, she handed him her boarding pass. Richard barely glanced at it before letting out a small, dismissive breath. Something about her appearance had already made the decision for him. "I'm going to need you to step back into the main terminal," he added, his voice slightly louder now, enough for nearby guests to hear. A subtle shift in attention followed. A few heads turned completely, others pretended not to watch, but listened all the same. Emily didn't move, her fingers tightened just slightly around the handle of her bag. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost gentle. "I believe I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." That was when Richard's expression changed. Not anger, not yet, but irritation, the kind that comes from being quietly challenged in a place where he expected control. "People like you," he said, letting the words hang just long enough to sting, "don't usually access this lounge." A hush fell, not complete silence, but close enough that every word seemed heavier, and Emily stood there, still composed, still steady, as if the weight of the moment hadn't touched her at all. And then she asked one question, "Are you absolutely sure about that?" And somewhere in the room something shifted, though no one could quite explain why. Richard Hayes held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if expecting her confidence to crack, but Emily Carter did not look away. Her expression remained steady, almost patient, and that quiet certainty unsettled him more than any argument could have. He let out a short, controlled laugh, glancing briefly at the nearby guests, as if inviting them to share in the moment. "I am absolutely sure," he replied, his voice now carrying across the lounge with deliberate clarity. "This area is reserved for verified first-class passengers, and I do not see anything here that suggests you qualify." A few people shifted in their seats. One man lowered his newspaper just enough to watch more closely. A woman near the bar leaned and whispering something to her companion, and somewhere behind the desk a junior attendant hesitated, clearly unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Emily slowly reached forward and tapped the boarding pass still in his hand. "You have not actually read it," she said calmly. There was no challenge in her tone, no edge, just a simple statement of fact, and that somehow made it worse. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. He glanced down for the first time properly. Scanning the ticket, his eyes moved across the printed details: seat number, gate information, boarding group, and then paused just briefly, too briefly for most people to notice, but long enough for something to register in his expression, something that did not quite fit the conclusion he had already decided on. He looked back up, quickly masking it with a practiced smile, the kind that could dismiss anything inconvenient without explanation. "This does not change anything," he said sharply. "If anything, it confirms that there has been some kind of error. We see this all the time. System glitches, misassigned boarding groups." He handed the ticket back with a slight flick of his wrist, as if returning something unimportant. "You will need to speak with customer service." Outside the lounge, a soft murmur passed through the room. The situation had shifted from curiosity to quiet discomfort. But no one stepped in, no one challenged him. The unspoken rule of places like this remained intact. Do not disrupt, do not interfere. Emily accepted the ticket, without looking at it, her fingers brushing lightly against the paper. Before lowering it to her side, she took a small breath, and for the first time her eyes moved not to Richard, but around the room. She saw the polished surfaces, the carefully curated silence, the people who had already decided who belonged and who did not. And when she looked back at him, there was something different, not anger, not frustration, but clarity. Are you denying me access? She asked, her voice still soft, but now unmistakably direct. Richard did not hesitate. Yes, he said firmly, I am denying you access to this lounge. And if you do not step out voluntarily, I will have security escort you out. The word security landed heavily in the air. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. One man cleared his throat, pretending to check his phone, while another turned away entirely, as if distancing himself from what was unfolding. Emily nodded once slowly, as if acknowledging something far larger than the moment itself. Then she spoke again, just above a whisper, but somehow louder than anything else in the room. Then I suggest you call whoever you need to call, she said, because this is about to become a much bigger problem than you think. And for the first time, Richard Hayes felt a flicker of uncertainty. He could not explain it. There was no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, nothing that should have challenged his authority. And yet something in her tone, something in the way she stood completely unshaken, made the room feel different, as if the balance of control had quietly shifted, and no one had noticed it happen. For a brief second no one moved. The air itself seemed to pause, as if the room was waiting to see whether Richard Hayes would double down or step back. But he had built his career on control, and he was not about to lose it to a woman who looked like she had walked in from the wrong terminal. His lips pressed into a thin line as he reached for the phone on the nearby desk, his fingers deliberate, his posture firm, as if the act alone would restore order. Security to the first class lounge, he said clearly into the receiver. We have a situation. His words echoed softly against the polished walls, and that single sentence shifted the atmosphere from quiet tension to something heavier, something irreversible. A few guests straightened in their seats, others avoided looking directly at Emily Carter, as if distance could separate them from the discomfort unfolding in front of them. The junior attendant behind the desk hesitated again, her eyes flicking between Emily and Richard, uncertainty written across her face, but she said nothing. Emily did not react. She did not step back. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there, her hand resting lightly on the handle of her bag, her gaze steady, her breathing even, as if she had already accepted whatever was about to happen. And that calmness began to feel out of place in a room where everything else was carefully controlled. Richard ended the call, placing the receiver down with quiet finality. You have about 30 seconds, he said, his tone colder, now more rigid than before. I suggest you use that time wisely. There was a faint shift in the crowd. Someone near the bar cleared his throat. Another passenger adjusted his jacket, as if preparing to leave the situation altogether. The unspoken tension was building layer by layer, and still Emily did not move. Instead, she glanced once toward the large glass windows overlooking the runway, where planes moved in slow, precise patterns under the afternoon sun, then back at Richard. Her voice when she spoke was softer than ever, but it carried further than before. You might want to reconsider that call, she said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple observation, and that made it more unsettling. Richard exhaled, sharply shaking his head. I have nothing to reconsider, he replied firmly. This is a private lounge with clear policies, and I enforce them equally for everyone. The word equally lingered in the air, almost too long, as if even he knew it did not quite hold under the weight of the moment. A faint sound interrupted the silence, then not loud, not dramatic, just the steady measured echo of footsteps approaching from the entrance behind them. One step, then another, slow, deliberate, unhurried. Conversations that had tried to resume faded again without anyone realizing it. Heads turned subtly, then all at once the room seemed to shift its attention toward the doorway, without knowing why, and Richard felt it before he saw it. That subtle change in energy, the kind that does not announce itself, but makes everything else feel slightly off. He turned instinctively, his expression still controlled, but something in his posture tightening, just enough to reveal the first crack, and standing at the entrance was a man in a tailored navy suit, his presence quiet but undeniable, his gaze moving across the room, not rushed, not searching, simply observing, and when his eyes landed on Emily Carter, He did not look surprised, he looked expected, as if this moment had been waiting for him to arrive, and the room went completely silent. The man did not rush, he did not raise his voice, and he did not need to, because the moment he stepped forward the entire atmosphere shifted, as if the room itself recognized him before anyone said a word. His shoes moved quietly across the marble, each step controlled, measured, until he stopped beside Emily Carter, not in front of her, not behind her, but exactly at her side, like he had always intended to be there. Richard Hayes straightened immediately, his posture snapping into something more formal, more alert, though he had not yet placed why the man felt familiar. There was something in the way the staff reacted, the subtle stiffness, the way the junior attendant lowered her eyes, the way even the guests seemed to sense that something important had just entered the space. "Good afternoon," Richard said, quickly forcing a polite smile. As he stepped forward, "I apologize if there is any disruption. We are handling a situation." The man did not respond right away. His gaze moved briefly from Richard to Emily and back again, his expression calm, unreadable, but not indifferent. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, yet it carried through the room with effortless authority. "What situation?" he asked. The question was simple, but it landed with weight. Richard cleared his throat, maintaining composure. "This passenger does not meet the requirements for access to the first-class lounge. We are in the process of escorting her out." He gestured lightly toward Emily as if presenting evidence that required no further explanation. A pause followed, not long, but long enough for the silence to become noticeable, and then the man looked directly at Emily. "Ms. Carter," he said, and for the first time a flicker of recognition passed through the room. Emily gave a small nod, nothing dramatic, nothing exaggerated, just acknowledgement. "I was beginning to wonder how long it would take," she replied softly, and that single exchange shifted everything. Richard's smile faltered just slightly, his eyes moving between them as he tried to understand the connection. "I am sorry, do you know each other?" he asked, his voice no longer as steady as before. The man turned his attention back to him fully now, and there was something in his gaze that made Richard instinctively straighten further, not out of respect, but out of something closer to realization. "I should," he said calmly. "I make it a point to know who flies with us." The word "us" hung in the air, heavy, deliberate, and unmistakable. A ripple of understanding began to spread across the room. Subtle at first, then undeniable. A guest near the window leaned forward, another lowered his glass mid-sip. The junior attendant behind the desk went completely still, as if afraid to move. Richard's expression shifted again, this time the confidence in his posture thinning, just enough to reveal uncertainty. "I see," he said carefully, "then perhaps there has been some confusion. I was simply following protocol." "Protocol," the man repeated quietly, as if testing the word, and then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before stepping slightly closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance. "Tell me, Richard," he continued, his tone still calm, still controlled, "what exactly is the protocol for denying access to someone who is already on the manifest of this lounge?" The question settled into the room like a weight. No one moved, no one spoke, and for the first time since this began, Richard Hayes opened his mouth without immediately knowing what to say. Richard Hayes felt the weight of every eye in the room as the question lingered unanswered. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, as if the words he had relied on moments ago no longer carried the same certainty. "Protocol," he repeated more quietly this time, as though saying it again might restore its authority. "I assessed the situation based on presentation and guest profile." A faint shift moved through the room at those words, subtle but unmistakable. The man in the navy suit did not react immediately. He simply studied Richard for a brief moment longer, his expression unchanged, but his silence far more revealing than any response could have been. "Presentation," he said finally, and there was something almost reflective in his tone, as if he were considering the word from a distance before returning it back to the moment. "Guest profile." Richard straightened slightly, sensing the need to defend his decision in front of someone who clearly held more influence than he had first assumed. "We maintain a standard here," he said carefully, choosing each word. "This lounge represents a premium experience. Our responsibility is to ensure that only those who meet that standard are granted access." And for a moment, it seemed like he might regain control of the narrative, his voice steady again, his posture firm. But then the man turned his head slightly, glancing around the room, taking in the guests, the polished surfaces, the quiet tension that still hung in the air before his gaze returned to Emily Carter, who had not moved, who had not spoken, who simply stood there as she had from the beginning, calm, composed, present. And when he looked back at Richard, something had shifted, not in volume, not in tone, but in certainty. And who exactly defines that standard? He asked. The question was gentle, but it carried a precision that cut through the room. Richard hesitated just for a fraction of a second, long enough for doubt to surface before he forced an answer. The airline sets the standard, he replied quickly, and I am responsible for upholding it. Another pause followed, and this one felt heavier than the last, because the man did not respond right away. Instead, he took a small step forward, closing the space between them just enough that Richard could no longer pretend this was a routine exchange. Then allow me to clarify something, he said, his voice still calm, still measured, but now unmistakably final. I am the one who sets that standard. The words did not need to be loud, they did not need emphasis, because their meaning landed instantly, completely, and without room for interpretation. The effect was immediate. A visible ripple moved through the lounge as understanding spread across every face. The man near the window lowered his glass entirely. The woman by the bar straightened her posture. The junior attendant behind the desk went pale, her hands frozen mid-movement. And Richard Hayes felt it most of all, the sudden collapse of certainty, the realization unfolding too quickly to stop. I see, he said faintly, though it was clear he had not seen anything until this moment. His voice no longer carried authority, it carried something closer to disbelief. I was not aware. That is precisely the problem, the man replied, not sharply, not angrily, but with a quiet finality that left no room for defense. You made a decision without awareness, without verification, and without respect. The word respect settled into the silence, heavier than anything that had come before, and Emily Carter finally shifted her weight, slightly, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had simply waited for the truth to arrive. And in that moment, the entire room understood that this had never been about a seat or a lounge or a policy. It had always been about something far more fundamental and far more visible than anyone had been willing to admit. Until now, Richard Hayes felt the words settle over him like a weight. He could not shake. His throat tightened slightly as he tried to recover some sense of control, but the room no longer belonged to him. It had shifted entirely, and he knew it. The confidence that had filled his voice minutes ago was gone, replaced by something fragile, something uncertain. I was only trying to maintain the experience, he said carefully, as if choosing the right words might undo what had already happened. The man in the navy suit did not interrupt. He allowed the explanation to unfold, but his silence made it clear that the outcome would not change the experience. He repeated quietly, and then his gaze moved again across the lounge, taking in every detail, the polished marble, the quiet observers, the staff standing still, as if waiting for permission to breathe. Do you believe this is the experience we promise our passengers? He asked, not loudly, not harshly, but with a clarity that left no space for avoidance. Richard hesitated again, longer this time, because the answer was no, and they both knew it, yet saying that out loud felt like admitting more than a mistake. It felt like exposing something deeper, something structural, something he had never questioned before. I followed what I believed was appropriate, he said finally, his voice lower now, less certain. And that belief is exactly what concerns me, the man replied, stepping slightly closer, not to intimidate, but to make sure every word landed where it needed to. Belief without verification becomes assumption, and assumption leads to moments like this. The room remained silent. No one moved, no one spoke, and Emily Carter stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But now, there was something else there, something quieter, something resolved, as if the moment had already passed for her, and she was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. The man turned slightly toward her. Miss Carter, he said with a small nod, I apologize for the inconvenience. You should not have been placed in this position. Emily met his eyes for a brief second, then nodded once. Thank you, she replied, her voice soft but steady, and that simple exchange carried more weight than any apology could have, because it acknowledged something beyond the situation, something about dignity, something about being seen. The man then looked back at Richard, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in his tone, not anger, not frustration, but decision. Effective immediately, he said, I want a full review of how access decisions are being made in this lounge and across all premium services. No one is to be denied without proper verification, and no judgment is to be based on appearance alone. The words were measured, precise, final, and Richard felt them land one by one, each sentence stripping away what little authority he had left. Yes, sir, he said quickly, his voice tight with the effort to remain composed. I understand. I expect that you "Do," the man replied calmly, "because this is not just about policy, it is about respect, and respect is not optional, it is the foundation of everything we represent." Another silence followed. But this one was different. It was no longer tense, it was reflective, as if the room itself had shifted from observation to understanding, and Emily Carter finally stepped forward, not hesitating, not asking permission, simply moving past Richard with quiet certainty, her bag rolling softly behind her as she crossed into the lounge she had never truly been excluded from, and no one stopped her, no one spoke as she walked through the space that had moments ago rejected her, and now seemed to make way, without question, and as she passed through the center of the room the same eyes that had once judged her now followed in silence, not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with something else entirely, something closer to recognition, and in that stillness one truth settled clearly over everyone present: respect had never been about who looked the part, it had always been about who deserved to be seen. Emily Carter moved deeper into the lounge, her steps unhurried, her presence no longer questioned, but quietly acknowledged as the soft wheels of her carry-on traced a steady line across the marble floor. Conversations that had once filled the space did not immediately return. Instead, there was a lingering stillness, as if the room itself was adjusting to what had just unfolded. A man seated near the window lowered his gaze to his coffee but did not lift it. A woman who had earlier whispered now sat upright, her expression more measured as she watched Emily pass, and behind them the staff stood in a subtle but visible shift of posture, straighter, more attentive, more aware. Richard Hayes remained near the entrance, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his shoulders squared, but no longer commanding the authority he had carried so easily before. His eyes followed Emily for a moment, then moved quickly away as if unable to hold the weight of that reflection for too long. The man in the navy suit remained where he was, his presence still quiet, but unmistakably central to everything that had changed. He did not call attention to himself, he did not raise his voice, but when he spoke again the room listened. "Richard," he said calmly, and Richard turned immediately. "Yes, sir." His voice came faster now, almost instinctive. "I want you to understand something clearly." The man continued, stepping slightly closer, not to dominate, but to ensure there was no distance left for misunderstanding. "This is not about a single decision, it is about a pattern of thinking that cannot exist in a place that represents our name." Richard nodded quickly. "I understand, sir, it will not happen again." The man studied him for a brief moment, as if weighing the sincerity behind the words. Then he gave a small nod. "I expect that it will not, but understanding requires more than agreement, it requires change. And that change begins with how you see people, not how you categorize them." The words were not delivered as punishment, they were delivered as truth, and that made them impossible to dismiss. The junior attendant behind the desk shifted slightly, her posture more alert, her expression thoughtful, as if she too was absorbing something beyond the moment itself. The man then turned his attention briefly across the lounge, his gaze passing over the guests who had witnessed everything, not accusing, not confrontational, simply present. And that presence carried its own message. Before he looked back toward Emily Carter, who had now reached a seat near the window, she placed her bag beside her and sat down quietly, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her eyes moving once toward the runway outside, where another aircraft began its slow approach. Descending steadily against the pale afternoon sky, she did not look back at Richard, she did not acknowledge the attention around her, she simply existed in the space that had always been hers to begin with. And that quiet ownership seemed to settle more deeply than any words could have. The man in the navy suit walked a few steps toward her, stopping at a respectful distance. "Everything is ready for your departure," he said gently. "There will be no further interruptions." Emily gave a small nod. "Thank you," she replied, her voice calm, unchanged, and as he turned to leave the room began to breathe again. Conversations resumed softly, glasses lifted once more, but something had shifted permanently, something subtle but undeniable. The way eyes met, the way voices lowered, the way presence was no longer measured by appearance alone. And near the entrance, Richard Hayes remained still for a moment longer before finally stepping back into position, not as the man who controlled the room, but as someone who had just learned that control, without understanding, was never truly control at all. And as the lounge returned to its quiet rhythm, one truth remained suspended in the air long after the moment had passed. Respect had not been given, it had been revealed. The lounge had returned to its rhythm, but it was no longer the same rhythm. It carried a quieter, Awareness, a subtle shift in how every movement, every glance, every silence was felt. Emily Carter sat by the window, the soft light from the runway, reflecting gently across her face as planes taxied in the distance, their motion steady, predictable, unlike the tension that had filled the room only minutes before. She rested her hands calmly on her lap, her posture relaxed, not because she had been proven right, but because she had never needed to prove anything at all. A flight attendant approached her, now slower than before, more deliberate, her smile respectful rather than routine. "Miss Carter, may I offer you something to drink?" The tone was different, not overly formal, not apologetic, just present. Emily looked up and gave a small nod. "Water would be perfect, thank you." The attendant nodded and stepped away carefully, as if mindful of every movement nearby. The same guests who had once observed her with quiet judgment now avoided staring too long, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. The man with the newspaper had folded it completely, setting it aside, his gaze drifting occasionally toward the window, as if giving her space. The woman near the bar lifted her glass again, but this time, without whispering, without commentary, just silence that carried more meaning than her earlier words ever had. Near the entrance, Richard Hayes remained standing, though his posture had softened slightly, his shoulders no longer squared with authority, but held with something closer to reflection, his hands unclasped, then clasped again as if unsure where they belonged. Now his eyes moved briefly across the lounge, then settled for a moment on Emily before lowering again, not out of avoidance, but out of understanding. The man in the navy suit had already stepped away into the hallway beyond, but his presence remained in the space like an echo that did not need repetition. The junior attendant behind the desk adjusted a stack of documents, though her attention was clearly elsewhere, her movements slower, more thoughtful, as if she too had begun to see the room differently, not as a place divided by appearance, but as a place shaped by how people chose to see one another. A quiet announcement sounded overhead, boarding for the next departing flight would begin shortly. The voice was calm, neutral, unchanged, but it carried through the lounge in a way that felt grounding, as if reminding everyone that time had continued, even as something within the room had shifted. Emily reached down and adjusted the handle of her bag, her fingers moving with the same steady precision she had shown from the beginning. She did not rush, she did not hesitate, she simply prepared. When the attendant returned with her glass of water, Emily accepted it with a small thank you, her voice soft but clear, and for a brief moment the two women held eye contact, not long, not dramatic, just enough to acknowledge what had passed between them without needing to speak it aloud. And then Emily turned her gaze back toward the window, the aircraft outside beginning its final approach, the wheels touching the runway with quiet certainty, as if guided exactly where they were meant to be. And inside the lounge something similar had settled, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply, a new awareness, a quiet correction, a shift in understanding that no longer needed explanation. And as the room continued forward in its polished routine, one truth remained, carried not in words, but in the way every person now held themselves. Dignity had never required permission, it had only required recognition. The announcement for boarding echoed once more, softer this time, as if the room had already begun to move on, but for Richard Hayes the moment had not passed. It lingered heavy in his chest as he stood near the entrance, watching the space he once controlled now unfold without him. He adjusted his jacket out of habit, though the gesture no longer carried the same confidence. His eyes moved again toward Emily Carter, seated calmly by the window, her presence unchanged, untouched by the tension that had defined the last few minutes. And for the first time, he allowed himself to truly observe her, not the clothes, not the surface, but the composure, the stillness, the certainty that had never needed validation. He took a slow breath, then stepped forward, his shoes quieter now against the marble, as if even the sound had lost its authority. A few guests noticed the movement, their attention shifting subtly, but no one spoke, no one interrupted. As he approached her, he stopped at a respectful distance, not too close, not too far. His voice, when it came, was measured, but different from before. It lacked the sharp edge, it carried something closer to humility. "Miss Carter," he said, and she looked up, her expression neutral, calm. As always, there was no trace of triumph, no satisfaction, just presence. "I owe you an apology," he continued, the words deliberate, as if each one required effort. "I made an assumption, and I acted on it without taking the time to understand the situation fully." He paused briefly, not searching for words, but allowing them to settle. "I should have treated you with the same respect I offer every guest. Emily listened without interruption, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed, as if she had already moved beyond the moment. He was still standing, and a faint silence formed between them, not uncomfortable, but reflective, and when she finally spoke, her voice remained soft, but carried clearly across the space. Respect is not something you offer selectively, she said. It is something you either have, or you do not. The simplicity of the statement left no room for interpretation, no room for defense, and Richard felt it more deeply than any reprimand could have. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her words. I understand, he replied, though it was clear he was still learning what that understanding truly meant. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not of acceptance, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement, the kind that marked the end of something rather than the repair of it. Richard stepped back, slightly, not dismissed, but no longer needed his role in the moment complete. As he turned away, the lounge continued around them, the soft clink of glass, the quiet murmur of conversation, the distant sound of aircraft engines humming beyond the glass walls. But everything felt different, more intentional, more aware. The junior attendant behind the desk watched briefly, then returned to her tasks. Her movements precise, as if guided by a new understanding. The flight attendant passed by again, offering assistance to another guest, her tone consistent, respectful, without hesitation, and Emily Carter lifted her glass of water, taking a small sip before setting it down, her eyes drifting once more to the runway where another plane aligned perfectly for departure, moving forward without disruption, without delay. And as she sat there untouched by the judgment that had once surrounded her, one truth settled deeper into the room, not spoken, not announced, but understood. Respect had never been something to grant, it had always been something to recognize before it was too late. The boarding call came again, this time with more urgency, as passengers began to gather their belongings, the soft rustle of movement spreading across the lounge like a quiet tide, rising. Emily Carter remained seated for a moment longer, watching as the aircraft outside completed its final preparations, the ground crew moving with practiced coordination beneath the fading afternoon light. Everything beyond the glass followed a system, precise, structured, predictable, unlike the assumptions that had unfolded just minutes before she reached for her carry-on, lifting it with ease, her movements calm, unhurried. As she stood, there was no need to rush, no need to prove anything. She simply moved when it was time, and that quiet timing carried more authority than any announcement around her. A nearby passenger stepped slightly aside, without thinking, creating space for her path. Another followed, doing the same, until a subtle corridor formed, not directed, not requested, but naturally given. And as she began walking toward the boarding area, the room seemed to adjust around her. Conversations lowered just enough, footsteps slowed just enough, eyes followed, not with curiosity now, but with awareness, with recognition of something they had overlooked before. Richard Hayes watched from a distance, his posture no longer rigid, his hands resting at his sides as if unsure where they belonged in this new version of the room he had spent years mastering. His gaze followed her briefly, then shifted away, not out of avoidance, but out of understanding that this moment was no longer his to influence. The junior attendant behind the desk straightened slightly as Emily passed, offering a small respectful nod, not rehearsed, not forced, just genuine. Emily returned it with a slight glance, a quiet acknowledgement that required no words, and then she continued forward. The hallway leading out of the lounge felt different, cooler, quieter, more grounded, as if the noise of the earlier tension had been left behind completely. The man in the navy suit stood near the entrance to the jet bridge, speaking briefly with another staff member, his tone low, composed, but when he saw Emily approaching, he stepped aside immediately, not out of obligation, but out of respect. His eyes meeting hers for a brief second. Everything is set, he said simply. There will be no further issues. Emily gave a small nod, thank you, and continued forward, her steps steady, her presence unchanged. As she crossed into the boarding lane, the attendant scanned her past, this time with full attention, her posture straight, her voice respectful. Welcome aboard, Ms. Carter. Emily stepped past her without hesitation, entering the aircraft, where the soft lighting and quiet arrangement of first-class seats awaited her. Space had always been prepared, it had never been denied, only delayed by perception, and behind her the lounge resumed its routine, but not its former state. Something had shifted too deeply to return entirely to what it was before. Conversations resumed, but with more care. Movements continued, but with more awareness, and Richard Hayes remained near the entrance for a moment longer, before finally turning back to his duties, not as the man who decided who belonged, but as someone who had just learned that belonging was never his to assign, and as the aircraft door began to close and the runway lights flickered on in the distance, one final truth settled quietly into the space left behind. Dignity had not been granted in that room. It had been revealed to everyone who was willing to see it. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere carried a different kind of quiet, not the tense silence of judgment, but the settled calm of structure and purpose. Emily Carter stepped into the first-class cabin, where soft ambient lighting reflected off polished surfaces, and wide leather seats awaited with quiet precision. A flight attendant greeted her with a warm, composed smile, her posture attentive, her tone measured. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Carter. We are glad to have you with us." Emily acknowledged her with a small nod before moving to her seat, placing her bag carefully in the overhead compartment, her movements efficient, familiar, as if this space had never been foreign to her at all. She sat down smoothly, her hands resting for a moment on the armrests before her gaze drifted toward the oval window beside her. Outside, the runway stretched wide under the dimming sky, lights beginning to glow in steady lines guiding aircraft toward departure. Everything moved forward as it always did, without hesitation, without question. A subtle shift occurred in the cabin as other passengers took their seats. Some recognized her not by name but by presence, by the quiet certainty she carried. One man across the aisle glanced briefly, then looked away with a small, thoughtful expression. A woman seated 2 rows ahead adjusted her posture slightly, as if becoming more aware of her own space. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with renewed attentiveness, their gestures consistent, respectful, each interaction deliberate, as if the earlier moment in the lounge had extended beyond those walls and into every corner of the experience. The cabin door remained open for a moment longer as final preparations continued, and then the man in the navy suit appeared briefly at the entrance, speaking quietly with the lead attendant, his voice low, composed, but his presence unmistakable. He did not step fully inside. He did not interrupt the flow. He simply ensured everything was aligned before giving a small nod and stepping back out of view. The door closed shortly after with a soft, controlled motion, sealing the cabin in its calm, contained environment. A gentle announcement followed, welcoming passengers and outlining the flight ahead, the voice steady, reassuring, unchanged, yet somehow carrying more weight now, as if every word was grounded in a renewed sense of purpose. Emily adjusted her seat, slightly leaning back as the aircraft began its slow push from the gate, the movement smooth, almost imperceptible at first, then gradually more defined as the engines hummed to life. Beneath the cabin floor, she watched through the window as the terminal lights passed by one after another, reflections shifting across the glass like quiet reminders of what had just taken place, not as conflict, not as disruption, but as clarity. The plane paused briefly on the taxiway, aligning itself with the runway ahead, a moment of stillness before motion, a moment where everything was exactly where it needed to be, and inside the cabin, that same stillness settled. Deeper, not spoken, not announced, but understood, in the way every passenger sat a little straighter, in the way every interaction carried a touch more awareness, in the way presence was no longer measured by appearance, but by something far more enduring. And as the engines increased in power and the aircraft began its steady acceleration down the runway, Emily Carter remained calm, her gaze forward, her posture unchanged, because the journey ahead had never been about reaching a destination. It had always been about moving forward with a dignity that no one else could define. And in that quiet, rising motion, one truth lifted with her: undeniable and clear respect was never given by a place, it was revealed by the way people chose to see one another. The aircraft lifted smoothly from the runway, the city lights below stretching into long, glowing lines before fading into the distance, and inside the cabin, the steady hum of altitude replaced the low tension that had once filled the lounge. Emily Carter remained composed, her gaze shifting from the window to the quiet space around her as the seatbelt sign remained illuminated. A flight attendant moved gracefully down the aisle, offering a warm smile to each passenger, her movements precise, her tone consistent. "Ms. Carter, may I assist you with anything before we reach cruising altitude?" Emily shook her head gently. "Thank you, I am fine." The attendant nodded respectfully and continued forward, her posture unchanged, yet subtly more intentional, as if every interaction now carried greater meaning. Across the aisle, the man who had earlier glanced at Emily leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful, his attention no longer divided by assumption, but grounded in quiet reflection. 2 rows ahead, the woman who had once whispered now sat in silence, her hands resting neatly in her lap, her posture, composed, her earlier judgment replaced by something quieter, something closer to awareness. The cabin settled into its rhythm, the soft glow of overhead lights, the faint rustle of fabric, the distant hum of engines carrying them steadily forward, and yet beneath that routine something had shifted, something subtle, but lasting, the way eyes met, without lingering too long, the way voices softened, without losing clarity, the way presence was no longer filtered through appearance, but understood through something deeper, something more honest. Emily adjusted her position, slightly, her hand resting near the armrest as she looked once more out the window, clouds now stretching beneath them like a quiet horizon, untouched, uninterrupted, the world below distant and small, and for a brief moment everything felt aligned, not because anything had been changed in that instant, but because something had been seen clearly, without distortion, without assumption. The seatbelt sign dimmed with a soft chime, signaling the transition into calm flight. Movement resumed. Gently around her, a passenger stood to retrieve something from the overhead bin. A flight attendant prepared service at the front of the cabin, and through it all the same quiet awareness remained present, not spoken, not acknowledged, but carried in every action. The lead attendant approached Emily once more, this time with a small tray, a glass of water placed carefully beside her. "Ms. Carter, if you need anything at all, please let us know." Emily gave a small nod, her voice calm. "Thank you." The attendant stepped back, her expression steady, and as she moved away, Emily allowed herself a single breath, deeper than before, not out of relief, not out of release, but out of recognition of the moment that had passed and the understanding it had left behind. Far beyond the lounge, far beyond the boarding gate, the experience had extended into something larger, something that would not remain contained within a single place or a single interaction. And as the aircraft continued its quiet journey above the clouds, one truth remained constant, carried not in announcements, not in policy, but in the way each person now chose to see the other. Dignity had never needed to be proven, it had only needed to be recognized before it was overlooked. At 35,000 feet above the ground, the world below had disappeared entirely, replaced by an endless stretch of clouds illuminated by soft evening light, and inside the cabin everything had settled into a quiet rhythm that no longer needed adjustment. Emily Carter remained seated by the window, her posture unchanged, her presence steady as the flight continued forward with smooth certainty around her. The subtle shifts that had begun earlier now felt natural, no longer forced, no longer conscious, simply integrated into the way each person carried themselves. The man across the aisle, who had once observed her with curiosity, now glanced only briefly before returning to his reading, not out of dismissal, but out of respect for her space. The woman seated ahead adjusted her scarf slightly, her movements composed, her attention no longer divided by judgment, but grounded in quiet awareness. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with consistent grace, their tone warm, their expressions genuine, each interaction shaped not by assumption, but by intention, and though no one spoke of what had happened earlier, its effect remained present. In every detail of the cabin, the way voices lowered naturally, the way eye contact held just long enough to acknowledge, but never to define, the way silence itself felt different, not empty, but understood. Emily reached for her glass of water, taking a small sip before setting it back down, her gaze drifting once more toward the window, where the horizon stretched endlessly ahead. There was nothing dramatic in her expression, no reflection of victory, no trace of frustration, only calm, only clarity, as if the moment in the lounge had already dissolved into something far simpler, something that no longer needed to be carried forward. The aircraft maintained its steady course, the engines humming with quiet consistency, the path ahead clear, uninterrupted, and in that stillness the truth of what had unfolded became even more apparent, not because it was spoken, but because it no longer needed to be proven. Elsewhere, far below in the terminal, the lounge would continue its routine, new passengers arriving, new interactions unfolding, but something within it would not return to what it had been, not completely, because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. Once a moment reveals what has been overlooked, it leaves behind a shift that lingers beyond the people who witnessed it, and Richard Hayes, standing once again at his post, would carry that shift with him, not as a memory of embarrassment, but as a reminder of what had been missing, not in policy, not in procedure, but in perspective, and somewhere in the quiet space between service and status, between appearance and assumption, that understanding would remain, waiting to shape every decision that followed. And inside the aircraft, Emily Carter sat exactly as she had from the beginning, unchanged, unaffected, because she had never needed the room to recognize her for her to know who she was. And as the plane moved steadily through the sky, one final truth settled, without sound, without announcement, but with absolute certainty. Dignity is not something that can be granted by position or taken away by perception. It is something that exists long before anyone chooses to notice it. And on that flight high above everything that once tried to define it, the world remembered what it looks like.